Welcome to Thar's Garage. In this video, I'm going to wrap up the XRAY GTXE 23 edition build. I want to do kind of a recap, build review, and anything you may want to be aware of before you start building. So overall, I enjoyed the build, the parts quality, the design itself, the little nuances, engineering nuances, I found amazing. I truly enjoyed it. I'm excited to see this thing run, but there were small issues, nothing too major. So I want to kind of walk y'all through it just in case you're interested in buying one. And that way, when you do build your own, you don't run into any of these issues. All right, so for bag one, there's no step shown for the spider gears for the diffs. So that's kind of weird. And the instructions weren't very clear on that. Use a rag or a towel to hold the diff together, or when holding the diff when you're tightening the screws, because the gears are sharp and can cut into your hand. Bag two doesn't always say to put thread locker on when going into metal or aluminum, so please be aware of that. That's kind of just a general rule of thumb when building RC cars. Anytime you go into metal, put thread locker, and unfortunately the manual doesn't mention thread locker in all the steps, so be wary of that. When installing nuts into the wing mount, or it wasn't really the wing mount, it was the body post mount back here, it was kind of tricky, and I ended up having to use shock pliers. There was originally some side-to-side play in the diffs, front and rear, once they were installed in the transmission, but I checked once they were installed onto the chassis, and they seem to be perfectly fine. I didn't want it to be too tight in case it caused too much friction or binding. So in bag three, when you're putting together the sway bars, it doesn't say to use thread locker on these collars, but that's something I'd recommend. And then when you set this distance, set your digital caliper to 4 millimeters, and that way you can just kind of put it in onto the side and then adjust it. That made it easy to set the anti-roll bar end links. And I think the ends of the roll bars actually have very poor quality. They're not flat. They look like they were just cut with some snips, and there are some burrs. And it could kind of, I think it's, even if you set it at 4 millimeters, that's not a very accurate way to set it because of the way the ends are cut. So take note of that. You probably want to use like a tweak station or some type of setup station to adjust and make sure that it's equal left and right. So I'm gonna see if I can kind of see the sway bar end link right here. That, you know, it's not nice and flush. It looks like it was cut poorly. So just take note of that. Step 4, or bag 4, the rod ends are really tough to get onto the threads. So definitely use some oil. And then, you know, XRAY doesn't follow the industry standard where the left-hand threads are on the left side of the car. So be wary of that if you want to build it to what XRAY wants, or if you want to build it to industry standard. And then a tip that I want to give is, you know, get the turnbuckles built and then adjust the turnbuckles to length after they're installed onto the chassis. However, there seems to be a lot of flex back here when you're trying to adjust these, so be cautious of that. You may want to hold, you know, the hub when you're adjusting it, so that way you don't put too much stress on it. In bag 5 is the front suspension. When you're putting that together, make sure you use thread locker on the set screws for the front sway bars. You're going into metal and you just don't want those to back out. Bag 6, continuing on the front suspension. Like the rear, the rod ends are tough to get on, so definitely use oil. And again, the turnbuckles are not built to industry standard in the manual. Left-hand threads are not necessarily always on the left-hand side, so take note of that if you want to build it to industry standard. And definitely once you build the, don't worry about those shock lengths, or don't worry about the turnbuckle lengths until you get it onto the chassis, and then adjust it while it's on the chassis, so that way it's easier to adjust. For some reason, my left-hand side turnbuckle, after it was installed, was binding a lot and didn't have a lot of free movement. And I found that for some reason on this left C-hub, it was hitting on this back portion here. And all I had to do was install a small shim, and it was like a 0.5 millimeter to move it up. And once everything was tightened down, it added enough play and nothing's binding anymore. All right, for bag 7, the steering. Definitely use oil on the threads for the turnbuckles before installing the rod ends. And again, the turnbuckles are not to industry standard, left-hand thread, right-hand thread. And then also don't worry too much about the lengths once you're building it. Kind of get the thread started, install it onto the chassis, and then adjust the length while it's on the car. It makes it a lot easier. Step 8, or bag 8, the center solid shaft and motor. I had some issues there. So the center gear, it actually took me a long time to make that video because I was having issues. But according to the manual, if you put this together per the manual, it'll actually push this gear further back, and it kind of touches the chassis and it binds up all of the drivetrain. So install the gear onto that metal plate with the through holes, the straight holes into the bosses of the center gear, and that will actually move the center gear forward and it'll eliminate the binding. I actually reached out to XRAY about that issue and told them that I think that the manual is wrong. They replied back and they agreed with me, so they're going to change that and reach out to their customers and put up, I guess, a supplement to the instructions. There is no bag 9. It goes on straight to bag 10. The electronics, I didn't have any major issues there. I just added oil to the servo turnbuckle to make the rod ends easier to install. In bag 11, the shocks, I was actually missing one of the O-rings, these O-rings here. So I was missing those O-rings. That's part number 971034. Luckily, I had some O-rings in my bag that would work. Unfortunately, they're red, so I guess it adds a little bit of color, but hopefully you're not missing any of those. The only other gripe I had is that not a lot of shock fluid was included, just enough to build the shocks, and not enough for any rebuilds or anything like that. And when you're putting the shocks onto the chassis using those aluminum pieces, there's no mention of thread locker, so be aware of that. So that's in the final assembly. So using the metal inserts onto for the shock installations, there's no mention of using thread locker, so be wary of that. Remember, always use thread locker when going into metal, so that way it doesn't back out. Other than that, didn't have any other issues. Like I said, really enjoyed the build, would highly recommend it, especially now that you know some of the issues I've had. You may be able to, you know, make sure that you don't have those issues or headaches. But hope you enjoyed the video series. I hope you really liked it as much as I enjoyed building it. Please like and subscribe if you did. It does help the channel and gives me motivation to do more videos. Please let me know down in the comments if you had any issues with your build, or if you'd like to know any more information. I definitely would love to hear from y'all. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.